Margaret Caldwell drove her father's iron stake into the frozen Montana ground, with both fists, knuckles splitting against the hammerhead on the third strike. Blood hit the snow, bright as a cardinal in winter. Behind her, 3 men on horseback watched from the ridge. Victor Aldrich's hired leather with dead eyes and loaded rifles, and not one of them moved to stop her. Not yet. The survey flag she'd tied to that stake read different numbers than the ones Aldrich had filed at the Ravalli County Courthouse. Different by 400 acres. 400 acres that didn't belong to him. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at something inside you, please hit that subscribe button right now and leave a like. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Margaret Caldwell and what she did next. The Helena Land Office had been empty for 11 days before Maggie arrived. She knew that the moment she stepped off the stage in Millhaven, Montana territory, and asked the driver where the Western Territorial Survey Company kept its offices. He'd looked at her the way men looked at women carrying instrument cases, like she'd gotten off at the wrong stop in someone else's life. "Closed up 3 weeks back," he said, not unkindly, already unhitching the team. Mr. Prescott took everything worth taking and headed back east, left owing half the town. Maggie stood on the frozen boardwalk with her father's leather survey satchel across her shoulder, a carpet bag at her feet, and $23 in the inside pocket of her wool coat. The letter from Western Territorial Survey had promised $60 on arrival and $15 per week for 6 weeks of boundary verification work across the Bitterroot Valley. She'd spent $31 getting here from Columbus, Ohio. She'd sold her mother's pearl earrings in Pittsburgh to cover the last leg. She did not cry. She had learned 3 years ago, standing in a lawyer's office while Thomas Caldwell's brother read the will, that crying changed nothing. Numbers changed things. Documents changed things. Tears were just water with nowhere useful to go. "The boarding house," she said. "Who runs it?" "Mrs. Farwell. 2 blocks north, yellow sign." He paused, glancing at the satchel. "You a real surveyor, Mrs. Caldwell," she said. "And yes." He nodded like he'd decided something. "Don't tell folks that right off. Town's got opinions about Prescott's people right now." She thanked him and walked 2 blocks north in boots that hadn't been resoled since September. Mrs. Farwell charged 40 cents a night and had the particular talent of asking questions that weren't questions. "Traveling alone, are we?" Not a question. "I am," Maggie said. "Husband. Deceased. Work. Between arrangements." Which was honest as far as it went. Mrs. Farwell studied her the way experienced women studied other women, not with cruelty, but with the calculation of someone deciding how much trouble to absorb. She had gray hair pinned tight, and hands like she'd washed other people's laundry for 30 years. She probably had. 3 nights, she said. In advance. Maggie paid $1.20 she couldn't spare, and carried her bags to a room that smelled of pine resin and old fire smoke. She set her father's satchel on the narrow bed first, then her carpet bag. Then she sat down and unfolded the letter from Western Territorial Survey and read it again, slowly, looking for anything she'd missed. She hadn't missed anything. The letter was genuine. The company was not. She pulled out her father's survey notebook, the big 1-field cloth cover pages warped from 20 years of Ohio weather and creek crossings, and opened it to the back. He'd kept a list there. Active land patents for the Bitterroot Valley filed with the General Land Office in Washington, D.C., copied by hand from public records 2 years before his stroke. He'd been planning to bid on the survey contract himself. He hadn't lived to try. She'd brought his notebook because it was the most valuable thing he'd left her. More valuable than the house Thomas had sold. More valuable than the instruments, even because anyone could buy instruments. Nobody else had her father's 20 years of fieldwork in their hands. She read the patent numbers until her eyes ached and the candle burned low. She found Rosa Espinoza on the second morning. Not by design. She'd been walking the main street of Millhaven, watching the town wake up and trying to form a plan from the few facts she had when the smell of heated irons and lye soap pulled her toward an open door with a hand-painted sign. Espinosa Laundry, finest in the territory. Below that, in smaller letters, someone had added, "Ask about mending." Inside, a compact woman with silver-streaked black hair worked 2 irons alternately, one heating while the other moved. She didn't look up when Maggie came in. "I don't need laundry done," Maggie said. "I need information. I'm willing to pay for it." Rosa Espinosa set the iron down, turned and looked at her with black eyes that had clearly seen every variety of desperate person this territory could produce. "What kind of information?" she said. "Victor Aldrich, what he's doing with the land patents in the valley." Rosa was quiet for a long moment. She picked up the iron again, ran it across a shirt collar. "You're not from Prescott's company." "I was hired by Prescott's company. The company is gone. I'm still here." "Why?" "Because I've looked at my father's copies of the original patents and something doesn't match. I need to find out what." Maggie set $2 on the counter, a full 5 days of room and board. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm a surveyor. I just want to understand what's happening with the land." Rosa looked at the money, then at Maggie. She put the iron on its rest, picked up the $2, and folded them into her apron pocket. "Sit down, Mrs. Caldwell." "Mrs. Caldwell." Rosa pulled a stool from behind the counter. "I'll tell you what I know. People talk when they're waiting for their shirts. You'd be surprised what important men say in their shirt sleeves." What she knew was this: Victor Aldrich had been filing amended survey maps at the county courthouse since the previous spring. The amendments showed different boundary lines than the original patents. Small differences, sometimes only 20 or 30 feet, but in the right places. Along creek beds, across timber stands, through the middle of the best grazing land in the valley. He was buying up the disputed strips and filing legal challenges against the original patent holders. Small ranchers and homesteaders who couldn't afford the fight were settling for whatever he offered. Larger operations were holding out, but the legal fees were bleeding them. "The Hargrove Ranch has been fighting him for 4 months, Rosa said. "Nathaniel Hargrove. Good man, stubborn man. Used to be a detective, I heard, so he knows when something's crooked. But knowing it and proving it are different animals." "The original patents would prove it," Maggie said. "If the amendments don't match the baseline surveys on file in Washington, Aldrich has the local survey records. His man redrew them." Rosa refilled her coffee, set a second cup in front of Maggie without asking. "He's got the county judge in his pocket and a lawyer from Helena who makes documents disappear. He doesn't have the federal patents." Rosa looked at her. "The original General Land Office patents," Maggie said, "filed in Washington before Aldrich got here. Those are federal records. He can't touch them." She opened her father's notebook on the counter between them. "And my father copied them 2 years ago, by hand, every parcel in the valley." Rosa looked down at the cramped columns of numbers and dates. Then she looked up at Maggie. "Can you read those?" "I wrote about half of them. My father's hands shook by the end. I did the copying while he dictated." Maggie closed the notebook. "Tell me how to find Nathaniel Hargrove." She didn't plan on driving stakes into his land before she'd introduced herself. That had been a decision made in about 4 seconds, standing on the ridge above the Hargrove Ranch, with Aldrich's amended survey map in one hand and her father's notebook in the other, watching 2 men on horseback pace out a new boundary line 400 yards into what every federal record said was Hargrove property. The men didn't see her at first. They were too busy driving their own stakes painted red, she noted, official-looking, designed to intimidate. Maggie had her father's iron stakes in the bottom of the satchel. She'd carried them from Ohio because the weight of them felt like something she shouldn't leave behind. She was hammering the third one into the frozen ground when Aldrich's men finally noticed her. "Hey!" The closer one walked his horse down the slope. Big man, thick through the chest with the patient eyes of someone who got paid by the day. "Hey, woman," What do you think you're doing? Establishing baseline reference points. She didn't look up. The stake needed to go in another 2 inches. Could you move your horse? I need a clear sight line to the creek bend. You need to put that down and get off this land. Whose land? She stood, wiped blood from her knuckle on her coat, and looked him in the eye. Because according to patent number 47, Montana BR 1879, filed with the General Land Office and recorded in Washington, D.C. on March 3rd of that year, this land belongs to one Nathaniel Hargrove of Ravalli County, Montana Territory. She held up her father's notebook. Would you like me to read you the legal description? It takes about 4 minutes. The man stared at her. His companion had ridden closer, hand resting on his holster, but not drawing, not yet. They were Aldrich's muscle, not his brain, and something in her voice had hit a register that confused them. Lady, the first man said, slow and careful. You don't know what you're walking into. I know exactly what I'm walking into. She picked up the hammer and her satchel. I've been looking at these numbers for 2 days. I know where every boundary line in this valley was set by the federal government, and I know where your employer moved them. The question is whether you want to be standing on the wrong side of that when it gets argued in front of a federal judge. She walked down the slope toward the ranch house. Behind her, she heard the 2 men talking in low voices, heard one of them ride away fast in the direction of town. The other one followed her at a distance, saying nothing. Nathaniel Hargrove came out of the barn when he heard the horse. He was a tall man, brown going gray at the temples, with the kind of stillness that came from years of watching situations develop before deciding whether to act. He looked at Aldrich's man on the ridge first, then at Maggie, then at the survey stakes she was carrying. Those aren't Aldrich's colors, he said. No, they're not. She stopped 10 feet from him. Mrs. Margaret Caldwell. I was hired by Western Territorial Survey to verify boundary records in this valley. The company dissolved before I arrived. I stayed because I found something in the records that needs addressing. He said nothing, just looked at her the way he'd looked at the ridge, assessing, not dismissing. Your north pasture boundary has been moved 400 yards south from its original patent line, she said. The amended survey Aldrich filed at the courthouse shows a creek bend as your northern marker. The original patent uses a granite outcropping approximately 400 yards north of that creek. I have the federal patent numbers. I have my father's field notes from when those patents were recorded. She held up the notebook. I have baseline triangulation points that can prove the discrepancy to any competent surveyor or federal land agent. Hargrove looked at the notebook. Who's your father? Was. Robert Caldwell, Columbus, Ohio. 23 years with the Army Corps of Engineers. He died last spring. Something shifted in his face, not softness exactly, but recognition of something real. You're cold, he said. Come inside. No. The kitchen was functional and clean the way a man's kitchen was when he'd been managing alone long enough to develop systems. Everything had a place. Nothing was decorative. A cast iron stove threw good heat, and a tin coffee pot sat on the back burner with the patience of long habit. He poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of her. She noticed the scarring on his hands, not ranch work, something older, sharper. She'd seen those marks before on men who'd used their fists in professional capacities. You were with Pinkerton, she said. His eyes came up fast. The scarring pattern on your right hand. My husband had a friend who worked for the agency. You hold a coffee cup like someone who's been in rooms where setting it down too fast was a bad idea. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Rosa Espinoza mentioned you'd been a detective. Former, he said. I know what Aldrich is doing, she said. I've seen this before, not here. Not with land, but the mechanism is the same. He's using a fraudulent secondary survey to create a legal cloud over your title. Once the cloud exists, he can tie you up in challenges until you run out of money to fight. The fraud is in the survey methodology. His man didn't use the original baseline points. He reset the triangulation from a secondary marker that's convenient for the new boundary, then filed it as if it were the original measurement. Hargrove set his cup down. I know that. I've known that since August. What I don't have is proof that holds up. Aldrich has the county surveyor in his pocket. The judge won't hear federal precedent unless I can put the original patent records in front of him in a form he can't dismiss. He leaned forward. Can you do that? I can do better than that. She opened her father's notebook to the Hargrove parcel. My father's notes include the original triangulation data, the baseline measurements from the federal benchmarks that were used to establish every patent in this valley. If I can get out to your north pasture and re-establish those baseline points, I can produce a survey document that shows measurement by measurement exactly how Aldrich's amended map was falsified. She looked up. It'll take 4 days, maybe 5. I'll need access to the land a horse and someone who can ride with me in case Aldrich's men take exception to what I'm doing. They'll take more than exception. I expect so. She closed the notebook. I need to be paid for my time. $20 for the survey, plus $5 a day for additional documentation work if the county challenge goes further. If we win and you keep the land, I want a letter of reference I can use to rebuild my practice. He studied her for a long moment. She held his gaze and let him look. She'd learned that from her father. Let the numbers speak, then let the silence work, don't fill it with reassurance. Why are you doing this? He said finally. Prescott's company is gone. Nobody's making you stay. Maggie looked down at her father's notebook. At his handwriting in the margins, careful, precise, even when his hands had started to shake. At the last entry dated 6 weeks before he died, a note to himself. Check the Bitterroot patents when the contract comes through. Something off about the southeast quadrant. He'd known. He'd seen it in the numbers before anyone had started moving stakes. My father spent 20 years making sure boundary lines in this country were where the government said they were, she said, so that people who'd been promised land actually got what they were promised. She ran her thumb along the edge of the notebook. Someone's been lying in these numbers for a year. He would have fixed it. She looked up. I'm fixing it. Hargrove picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. $5 a day, he said, and I ride with you. Agreed. She extended her hand across the table. He shook it. Not the way men shook women's hands, gently, minimally, treating the gesture like it might break something. The way he'd shake another surveyor's hand. Firm, brief, equal. She pulled her hand back and opened the notebook to the baseline calculations. Then let's start with the north pasture markers, she said. I need to understand the terrain before the light goes. He stood, took his coat from the hook by the door, and handed her a second cup of coffee in a tin she could carry. One thing, he said, not looking at her, pulling on his coat. Yes. Aldrich sent a man to the courthouse this morning, filed an emergency injunction on 3 more parcels. He opened the door. Wind came in cold and hard. We've got until Friday before the county judge rules on the challenge to mine. Maggie put her father's notebook in the satchel and stood. Then we'd better be accurate and fast, she said, and we'd better be right the first time. She walked out the door ahead of him, into the Montana cold, her father's iron stake still in her hand, its painted flag snapping hard in the Bitterroot wind. And behind her, she heard Nathaniel Hargrove pull the door shut on his empty kitchen and follow her toward whatever was waiting at the north pasture line, not because she needed an escort, but because the work wasn't going to do itself, and they had 4 days to prove what the numbers had been saying all along. The frozen ground rang like iron under her boots. She kept walking. The north pasture ran for 2 miles before it hit the tree line, and Maggie walked every foot of it. She moved with her father's compass open in her palm, reading the needle the way other women read letters, with total absorption, with the particular stillness of someone receiving important news. Behind her, Nathaniel Hargrove led his roan mare at a walk and said nothing which she appreciated. Men who felt the need to fill silence during survey work had cost her more mistakes than bad weather ever had. At the creek bend, she stopped. She crouched down, set the compass flat on a rock, and pulled the notebook open to her father's entry on the Hargrove parcel. The creek bent northwest here, just as Aldrich's amended map showed. But her father's notes said the original baseline measurement hadn't used the creek at all. It had used the granite outcropping. She could see it from here, gray and stubborn, jutting from the hillside 400 yards north, like it had been put there on purpose. Which, in a surveying sense, it had. "There," she said. Hargrove came up beside her. "The outcropping." The original federal survey team used it as a permanent benchmark. Granite doesn't move, doesn't flood, doesn't shift with the seasons. Creek bends are convenient, but they migrate. Any surveyor worth his training knows you don't use a creek bend as a primary boundary marker. She stood, brushed dirt from her knees. Aldrich's man used it anyway. Because it put the line 400 yards south of where it belongs. Because it put the line exactly where Aldrich needed it to be. She started walking north toward the outcropping. The question isn't whether he did it. The question is whether I can prove the original measurement step by step in a form the Federal Land Office will accept. Can you? Ask me again in 4 days. He walked beside her, and she noticed he matched her pace without adjusting. For her didn't slow down or speed up. Just walked at the same rate two people walk when they're going to the same place for the same reason. She'd been aware of that about him since he'd shaken her hand across the kitchen table. He had a way of treating her presence as a given, not a novelty. Like the work was the point, and she was the work. She didn't know yet whether to trust it. At the granite outcropping, she set the satchel down and began unpacking. The theodolite first, her father's brass gone green at the joints lens, scratched from decades of field use and as accurate as the day it was made. Then the chain measure, 66 feet of hand-forged iron links. Then the notebook held open with a flat stone against the wind. "I need you to hold the far end of the chain," she said, "and stay exactly on the line I give you. Don't compensate for the slope. Don't adjust if the ground is uneven. Just hold it level." "I've used a chain before." "I know. Hold it level anyway." He almost smiled at that. Almost. They worked for 3 hours without stopping. Maggie called out numbers and recorded them in columns that would have made her father proud, precise, cross-referenced each measurement, taken twice from different positions. Hargrove held the chain where she put it and read back her numbers without error. When she asked him to move the rod 6 inches east, he moved it 6 inches east. Not approximately 6 inches, not close enough. 6 inches. By the time the light started going flat and gray, she had enough baseline data to establish beyond argument that the original patent marker was the granite outcropping and that Aldrich's amended map had moved the boundary line by 412 yards, not 400 as she'd estimated. 412 yards. She wrote the number twice and underlined it. "That's better than I thought," she said, not to him exactly, more to the number itself. "Better how?" A 400-yard discrepancy could be argued as measurement error, equipment variance, seasonal ground shift, human mistake. She closed the notebook. 412 yards in a straight line, consistently favoring one direction using a secondary marker that any trained surveyor would know was inappropriate. That's not error. That's a decision. She looked up at him. Decisions can be proven. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then, the other ranchers in the valley, the ones who already settled with him. "If your survey shows the discrepancy, it shows it on every parcel where the amended map was used." "Yes." She repacked the theodolite with the care of someone packing something irreplaceable. "But those settlements were voluntary. Getting them undone is a legal question, not a survey question. I can give you evidence. What you do with it in court is someone else's job." "We don't have a lawyer." "I noticed." She buckled the satchel closed. Rosa Espinoza mentioned a circuit judge who comes through in March. Federal appointment, not county. March is 4 months away. Friday is 4 days away. The county judge's ruling is what we're working against." She stood. Her knees hurt from the cold ground, but she didn't let it show. "If we can produce a complete survey document before Friday that establishes the baseline discrepancy with federal citations, Aldrich's amended map becomes a contested document, not an accepted one. That doesn't win your case, but it stops the injunction from going through unopposed." He looked at her for a long moment in the fading light. "You understand you're asking me to walk into that courthouse with a woman's survey work and expect a county judge to take it seriously?" "I understand that completely." She picked up the satchel. "Do you—" He picked up the chain coil and slung it over his shoulder. "I'll figure it out." "That's not the same as yes." "No," he said. "It's not." He started back toward the horses. "Come on, it's getting dark and you haven't eaten since this morning." She followed, and she noticed he carried the chain coil, without comment, the heaviest piece of equipment, the one she'd been hauling all day, and said nothing about it, offered nothing, just picked it up as if the distribution of load was a practical question and not a statement. She filed that away next to the handshake and the coffee she could carry. Kick. There were 4 ranch hands at the Hargrove place, and they ate dinner at a long table that had seen better decades. The oldest was a man named Cutter, weathered deliberate with gray braids and the particular economy of motion that came from spending 60 years doing physical work in hard country. He'd been at the ranch since before Hargrove bought it, had come with the land, like the timber and the creek. He looked at Maggie the way he'd look at an unfamiliar tool examining its construction before deciding whether it was worth using. The youngest was a boy of about 20, who introduced himself as Pete, with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet learned that enthusiasm drew attention. He'd already knocked over his own water cup twice before Maggie sat down. The other 2 brothers, named Sam and Dell, both somewhere in their 30s, had the matching quality of men who'd worked the same land so long they'd developed the same posture, the same way of moving, the same habit of looking at anything new, with identical expressions of patient skepticism. Hargrove set a pot of venison stew on the table, said, "Eat," and sat down. Nobody made any comment about Maggie's presence until Cutter said, without looking up from his bowl, "You're the woman who drove stakes on the North Ridge this morning." "I am." "Aldrich's man came by the gate at noon, said the stakes were an act of trespass and would be removed by county order before end of week." "They can try." She reached for the bread. "The stakes reference the original federal patent markers. Removing them is destruction of survey evidence. That's a federal offense, not a county matter." Cutter looked at her, then fully for the first time. Whatever he'd been assessing, the assessment appeared to conclude. He went back to his stew. "Pass the bread." Pete said, "You really think you can prove it, that what Aldrich did was fraud?" "I know it was fraud. Proving it and knowing it are different problems. The knowing is already done." She poured coffee from the pot at her elbow. "The proving takes 4 more days of work. And if Aldrich's men don't let you work—" She looked at him over the rim of her cup. He was young enough that the question was genuine, not challenging. He actually wanted to know. "Then we work anyway," she said, "and they decide how far they're willing to take that." Sam or Dell, she hadn't sorted them yet, said, "Billy Crane's in town." The table went quiet, in the particular way it went quiet, when a name meant something specific. Hargrove set his spoon down. "When?" "Rode in this afternoon, staying at the hotel." The brother Sam, she'd decided, because he talked slightly more, looked at Maggie. "He's Aldrich's hired gun, not local. Comes in when Aldrich wants something more than discouragement." Maggie thought about the man on the ridge that morning, big, patient professional. "That was Crane on the ridge." "Probably." Hargrove picked up his spoon again. "He doesn't usually show his face until things are close to the end." "Then we're close to the end." She opened her notebook to the day's measurements, spread it on the table beside her bowl. "Which means we work faster." She looked at Cutter. "I need someone who knows the valley terrain for the West Pasture survey tomorrow. Not a guide. Someone who can identify landmarks accurately and hold a chain line without drifting. Cutter looked at Hargrove. Hargrove gave a small nod. "I'll do it," Cutter said. "Good. Dawn." Pete started to say something caught Maggie's eye, and said instead, "Yes, ma'am," which wasn't what he'd been planning to say, but was clearly the right instinct. She worked until midnight at the kitchen table. The lamp burned low, and she let it, not wanting to wake anyone for more oil, when she could read her own handwriting by what was left. The numbers from the north pasture ran down 3 pages in tight columns, cross-referenced against her father's original data, and the alignment was exact in the places it needed to be exact and damning in the places it needed to be damning. She heard Hargrove before she saw him, boots on the floorboards, the deliberate weight of a man walking in his own house and trying not to disturb it. "You should sleep," he said from the doorway. "I will. I want to finish the north pasture documentation first." She didn't look up. The baseline calculation takes about an hour to write out in citation format. Federal Land Office has a specific form. You've submitted survey documents to the Federal Land Office before. Twice. Once in Ohio, once in Pennsylvania. My name was listed as assistant both times, even though I did the primary work. She finished a column, moved to the next. My father's name was the one that counted. That's why I need the letter of reference from you when this is done. An Ohio assistant credit doesn't establish an independent practice in Montana. He was quiet for a moment. That's why you stayed, after Prescott's company folded. Partly. What's the other part? She set down her pencil, then, which was not something she did easily in the middle of a calculation. She looked at the notebook, at her father's handwriting in the margins, next to her own, at the entries that stopped 6 weeks before he died, and started again in her hand. My father knew something was wrong with the Bitterroot surveys before he died, she said. He wrote a note to himself to check them. He didn't get the chance. She picked up the pencil again. I have the chance. So. He didn't say anything to that, which was the right response. The wrong response would have been to call it admirable, or touching, or brave. It wasn't any of those things. It was just a job her father had left unfinished, and she had the skills to finish it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Show me what you found. She showed him. All of it, the baseline measurements, the discrepancy calculations, the pattern of how Aldrich's amended surveys consistently favored a single direction, the specific technical errors that no competent surveyor would make accidentally. He followed every line without asking her to slow down or explain elementary concepts, and she understood after a few minutes that he was reading the numbers the same way he'd probably read criminal evidence looking for the structure of intent, not just the fact of the act. He used the same false benchmark on all 6 parcels, Hargrove said. The same one. Slightly different execution on each, enough variation that you'd have to compare them side by side to see the pattern. But the same underlying methodology. She pulled the relevant pages forward. If you compare Parcel 4 and Parcel 7, you can see he adjusted the chain angle to account for different terrain, but the baseline error is identical, to the foot. Hargrove looked at the 2 pages for a long time. That's not one man making a mistake. That's one man following instructions. Yes. Aldrich told him exactly where the line needed to be, and he reverse-engineered a survey that produced it. That's my conclusion. He leaned back. Can you prove that in front of a judge? Not just the discrepancy, the deliberate nature of it. The pattern proves the intent. 2 instances could be error. 6 identical instances is a decision. She gathered the pages. But I need to finish the west pasture and verify 2 more parcels before I can present it as a complete record. What I have now is sufficient to contest your parcel specifically. What I'll have in 4 days is sufficient to challenge the entire program. Fridays in 4 days. I know. He stood, went to the stove, came back with 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her. Not a gesture, not an offering, just coffee because it was midnight and they were both still working. She drank it. Aldrich will know what you're doing by morning, he said. Crane saw you on the ridge. He'll have reported back. I assumed. That doesn't concern you. She looked at him, then directly the way she'd looked at Aldrich's man on the ridge that morning when she'd told him about federal offense jurisdiction. I've had men try to stop my work before, she said. Not with guns, with signatures, with legal language and inheritance law, and the particular smile of a lawyer who already knows which way the ruling goes. She set her cup down. Guns I can understand. There are rules to guns, when to show them, when to use them, what they're communicating. The other kind of opposition, the kind that works through documents and signatures, and men who smile that I've already beaten once. When I memorized every federal survey citation in my father's library and taught myself to read patent records. She closed the notebook. Nobody expects a woman to know what those numbers mean. That's the only advantage I have, and I intend to use it completely. He looked at her with the same steady attention he'd given the North Pasture Ridge and the survey data and his own scarred hands. You're going to need that advantage, he said. Crane isn't the kind of opposition that reads legal citations. I know. She stood, picked up the notebook. That's why I need you. Not to protect me. I need you to ride the line and make sure the physical markers stay in place while I work. If Aldrich pulls my stakes, I lose the baseline reference and have to start over. I can do that. I know you can. She moved toward the narrow room off the kitchen that he'd given her with its single window facing east and its rope bed that was better than Mrs. Farwell's by a meaningful margin. She stopped at the door. Mr. Hargrove. Nate. She looked back. The men who are losing their parcels to Aldrich's challenges. The ones who settled already. Do you have contact with them? Some. I'd like to talk to them. Not this week, I don't have time this week. But after Friday, if there's still a case to be made. She held the notebook against her chest. What happened to them happened for the same reason it's happening to you. The same benchmark. The same false methodology. The evidence I'm building covers all of it, not just your parcel. She looked at him steadily. They deserve to know what was done to them, even if the law can't undo it. Maybe especially then. He held her gaze, and something in his face changed, not softened exactly, but deepened like a level reading that came in truer than expected. I'll reach out to them, he said. Good. She turned back to the door. Dawn. I need to be on the west pasture before Crane is on the ridge. She went in and closed the door, and she heard him stand at the table for a long moment before his boots crossed the floorboards back toward the stairs, slow and deliberate, a man carrying the specific weight of someone who had just been given back in 4 days, and the price of a survey, something he'd been losing for months without knowing how to stop it. Outside, the Montana wind moved through the bitterroot pines, and somewhere in the dark, 400 yards north of where Aldrich had said the line was, her father's iron stake stood in the frozen ground with its flag snapping, marking the place where the truth had always been. The West Pasture survey took all of Tuesday and most of Wednesday morning, and by the time Maggie had her final measurements recorded, her hands had stopped feeling the cold entirely, which she knew from experience meant they were colder than was sensible. Cutter worked the chain without complaint and without conversation, which suited her. He had the quality of very old land, present solid, not requiring acknowledgement to continue existing. When she asked him to hold a position, he held it. When she called a number, he repeated it back exactly. After the 3rd hour, she stopped checking his chain angle because it was always correct. On the ride back, he said, My grandfather surveyed for the Army in Tennessee, before the war. Is that where you learned to hold a line? That's where I learned what a line means. He looked at the valley spread below them, the winter grass, pale gold, the creek catching what light there was. People died over bad surveys down there. Wrong lines, wrong maps, wrong ideas about where one man's land ended and another's began. People are dying over this one too, she said. Just slower. He nodded once, and that was the end of that conversation, and it was enough. Back at the ranch, she spread Tuesday's measurements across the kitchen table and began the comparison work. Parcel by parcel, Aldrich's amended surveys against her father's original patent data, her own fresh field measurements against both. The pattern was even cleaner than she'd expected. The false benchmark wasn't just an error of convenience, it had been chosen with precision. Whoever had redrawn these surveys understood exactly what they were doing and had done it with the care of someone who expected to be challenged eventually and wanted the challenge to be difficult. That told her something. She was still thinking about what it told her when Hargrove came in at dusk with mud on his boots and a look that said the day had produced something worse than cold ground. Aldrich filed 2 more injunctions this afternoon, he said, sitting down across from her and pulling the mud off his boot with the kind of controlled force that meant he was angry and managing it. The Henderson parcel and the Whitefish Creek homestead. Henderson's got 3 kids and a sick wife. He's settled inside of an hour. For how much? 40 cents on the dollar, cash which he needed. Hargrove set the boot down. Aldrich knew he needed it. Knew it because Henderson had to borrow from the Millhaven Bank last spring, and the bank reports to Henderson's own land records, Maggie said. Aldrich is using the bank's loan records to identify who's financially vulnerable enough to settle fast. That would be my reading. She turned back to the table, pulled a blank page, began a new column. That's not in the survey records, that's a separate offense. Can you document it? Not from what I have. But Rosa might know which ranchers borrowed from the Millhaven Bank, and in what amounts. If there's a correlation between the loan records and the order Aldrich chose his targets. She was already writing the timeline. It establishes a coordinated scheme, not just a surveyor's error that benefited one party. An active operation designed to exploit financial vulnerability alongside fraudulent documentation. He was quiet for a moment. That's a bigger case than one ranch's boundary dispute. Yes. She finished the column, put the pencil down, and looked at him. Is that a problem? No. He pulled off the second boot, set it beside the first. It's a better case. She almost smiled at that. She turned back to her papers before he could see it. Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway with a pot of something that smelled like beans and an expression of someone who had news he wasn't sure how to deliver. Billy Crane was at Morrison's store today, he said, putting the pot on the stove. Asking about Mrs. Caldwell. How long she'd been in town, what she was working on, who she was working for. What did Morrison say? Hargrove asked. What he knows, which isn't much, but Mrs. Farwell was there. Pete stirred the pot without looking at either of them. She said she'd rented a room to a surveyor hired by Western Territorial Survey, and that was the extent of her knowledge. That's more than nothing, Maggie said. Crane also asked if anyone knew where she'd come from originally and whether she had family in the area. Pete put the lid on the pot. Cutter said I should tell you that part specifically. She understood what the question meant. It meant Aldrich was deciding how much inconvenience she represented, whether she was a local problem with local ties that needed careful handling, or a transient problem with no one watching that could be made to go away more directly. The answer she'd have given him if he'd asked was neither. But he wouldn't ask her. He'll know by tomorrow that I have no family within 1,000 miles, she said. That's fine. Let him know. Hargrove looked at her. A woman with no local ties who turns up dead or injured raises federal questions, she said. A woman with no local ties who simply disappears or leaves town is a different calculation. He wants to know which kind of problem I am. She closed the notebook. I intend to be the federal kind. The silence in the kitchen had a particular texture to it, Pete at the stove not stirring anymore, just standing. Hargrove looking at her with that steady attention that she was learning meant he was recalibrating something. You've thought about this before, he said, about being a woman working alone in places where someone wants the work stopped. Every time I take a job. She said it without weight, just fact. You think about weather, You think about terrain. You think about equipment failure. You also think about who doesn't want you there and what they're likely to do about it. It's part of the preparation. He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might say something that would require her to correct him. Something about protection, or caution, or the particular careful language men used when they meant you shouldn't be doing this alone. But he didn't. He said, "What do you need from me tomorrow?" "The East Ridge. 2 parcels, maybe 3 if the terrain allows. And I need someone at the granite outcropping by mid-morning to check that my stakes are still in place." "I'll send Sam." "Tell him not to move anything, not even if it looks like it shifted. I need to know if it was moved, not corrected." "He'll understand that." Pete served beans and cornbread, and they ate, and the kitchen was warm. And outside, the bitterroot wind said what it always said, which was that warmth was a temporary arrangement, and the cold was the permanent condition of the world, and everyone inside chose to disagree with it for one more night. Thursday arrived with the specific hostility of a Montana morning that had decided to make a point. The temperature had dropped hard overnight, and the ground that had been merely frozen was now iron, and the iron stake on the North Ridge had been pulled and thrown 30 yards east into the brush, its flag torn off and left in the dirt like an answer. Sam found it at first light and came back to the ranch at a gallop. Maggie was already packed and moving when she heard the horse. She came out the kitchen door with her satchel and her father's notebook under her arm, and looked at Sam's face and said, "Which one?" "North Ridge, the main baseline marker." "Just the one." "Just the one I checked. There could be others." She turned back inside, put the notebook on the table, opened it to the North Pasture data. If the main baseline marker was gone, the secondary reference points were still there. She'd driven 4 supplementary stakes specifically because she'd expected this. The primary calculation was already documented. The stake's current position didn't change the survey record. The removal of it was itself evidence. "It doesn't set us back," she said half to herself. "It adds a count." Hargrove came in from the barn, at that point, read the situation from Sam's face and Maggie's posture and said, "Crane." "Most likely," Sam said. "Tracks came up from the South Road single horse." "I need to document the removal," Maggie said, "before anyone else goes up there. The position of the thrown stake, the torn flag, the tracks. All of it." She looked at Hargrove. "Can you ride with me?" "Already planning on it." They were on the North Ridge within the hour. Maggie moved through the site the way her father had taught her to move through anything that had been disturbed, slowly outward from center, noting before touching. The stake lay where Sam had described it, the iron cold and clean in the frost. The flag-red cotton, her own, had been torn, rather than cut, which told her something about the state of mind of whoever had done it. She measured the distance from the original hole to where the stake had landed. 31 feet. She recorded it. She sketched the track pattern in the snow. She noted the time, the temperature, the condition of the ground. She did it all with the same precision she applied to the survey measurements, because documentation was documentation, regardless of what it was documenting, and she had learned from her father that you recorded everything and decided later what mattered. Hargrove watched her work without interfering. When she was done, she straightened and looked at the empty hole where the baseline marker had been. "He's not trying to stop the survey," she said. "He's trying to make me question whether I can defend it. If the marker's gone, he thinks I'll wonder whether the baseline is clean." She looked at Hargrove. "But it's in the notebook. Everything's in the notebook." "He doesn't know about the notebook." "No." She picked up the thrown stake and handed it to him. "Keep this. Don't drive it back in. I want it in my possession when I present the survey record." He took it, looked at it, put it in his saddlebag. "You're building a different kind of record than I thought." "I'm building the only kind that works. A survey document tells a judge where the line is. A survey document plus evidence of deliberate interference tells a judge why someone wanted the line to be somewhere else." She checked the supplementary stakes, all intact as she'd hoped. "By tomorrow afternoon, I'll have both." They rode the East Ridge through the morning. The cold was serious enough that Maggie's compass hand went numb by midday, and she switched it to the other hand, which was only marginally better. Hargrove gave her his gloves at some point without comment, and she put them on because arguing about it would have cost 15 minutes she didn't have, and the gloves were warmer than hers. The East Ridge survey produced what she needed. 3 more parcels, all showing the same false benchmark, all with the same directional error, all consistent with the pattern she'd already documented. By the time they came off the ridge with the light failing, she had a complete survey record for 5 of the 6 challenged parcels in the valley. The 6th, the Whitefish Creek homestead that Henderson had already settled, she would document anyway, because the record should be complete even if Henderson's fight was already over. On the ride back, Hargrove said, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me." "The circuit judge, the federal appointment Rosa mentioned." He kept his eyes on the trail. "I reached out to him last month before you arrived. Sent a letter to Helena through a contact I had from my Pinkerton days." He wrote back. She looked at him. "He's coming to Millhaven, not in March." He paused. "Next Tuesday." She calculated it. Tuesday was 5 days after Friday. 5 days after the county judge's ruling, which Aldrich had structured to go through unopposed. He'll rule Friday. Aldrich takes possession of the contested parcels over the weekend, and by Tuesday the transfers will be recorded and the federal judge will have nothing to stay. That's the plan. You knew this. I suspected it. I confirmed it yesterday through my contact. Aldrich has a recording clerk on his payroll. The transfer paperwork is already drafted. She rode for a moment without speaking. The cold pressed in, and the pine trees stood dark on either side of the trail, and the bitterroot made its patient sound over rocks in the near distance. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because it changes the timeline." He looked at her then. "It doesn't change what you're doing. The survey record is still the foundation of any challenge. But getting it in front of the right judge before Friday means going around the county courthouse entirely, and for that I need someone I trust to carry the documentation to Helena on the morning stage." "Who?" "Cutter. He knows the Helena land office from the old days, knows how to file an emergency petition." He paused. "But I need the survey document complete and in order tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." She thought about what was left: the Whitefish Creek parcel, the final cross-referencing the federal citation format that had to be exact, or the land office would reject the filing on procedural grounds. She thought about the lamp at Mrs. Farwell's that was too low, and the kitchen table at the ranch that was good, and the notebook that had her father's handwriting in the margins next to hers. "Tonight," she said. "All right." Maggie. First time he'd used her given name. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without decoration. "I should have told you about the circuit judge when you arrived." "Yes." "I didn't because I didn't know yet whether the survey route was real or whether Aldrich had sent you." She'd thought that possibility had occurred to him. She was mildly surprised it had taken him this long to say it directly. And now, nobody sent by Aldrich would work the way you work. He looked back at the trail. And nobody who was playing a role would have her father's handwriting in her notebook. She rode for a moment, watching the ranch lights come up ahead in the dark. "I'd have thought the same thing in your position," she said. "I don't hold it against you. Knowing you don't hold it against me isn't the same as having been right about you." "No," she said. "It's not." She clicked her horse forward. "We've got 5 hours of usable lamplight and about 6 hours of documentation. Let's not spend more of it on this." He rode up beside her and they came down off the ridge together, moving at the same pace, and behind them, the last light went out of the sky, and the stars came up sharp and cold over the bitterroot, and ahead of them the kitchen window threw a yellow rectangle across the snow that looked from a distance like something worth riding toward. Inside, Rosa Espinosa was sitting at the kitchen table. Maggie pulled up short in the doorway. Rosa had her own ledger open in front of her, the small one she'd shown Maggie on the first morning, the one with columns of information gathered in a laundry shirt by shirt and conversation by conversation. "I've been waiting an hour," Rosa said without preamble. "Sit down. I have something you need to see before you write that document tonight." She turned the ledger to face them, and Maggie leaned in. And what she saw changed the shape of everything she'd thought she understood about what Victor Aldrich was doing in the Bitterroot Valley and why. It was worse than a fraudulent survey. It was worse than she'd been prepared for, and she had been prepared for quite a lot. She pulled out a chair and sat down, and she opened her father's notebook to a fresh page, and she said, "Start from the beginning." Rosa's ledger held 4 years of conversations. Not written as conversations, written the way a careful woman records information she can't afford to forget in the margins of laundry accounts between columns of soap costs and pressing fees. Names, dates, numbers that weren't laundry prices. Rosa had been keeping this record since the first season Aldrich arrived in Millhaven, when a Chicago lawyer came in with a silk shirt that needed pressing and talked to his associate the entire time, as if a Mexican woman running an iron couldn't understand English well enough to matter. "The syndicate isn't buying land to sell to the railroad," Rosa said. She turned 3 pages, stopped at a column that ran down the right margin of an April account. "The railroad already has a route. It was filed in Washington 18 months ago. The Bitterroot Valley isn't on it." Maggie looked at the column. Names of companies abbreviated but recognizable to anyone who'd spent time reading federal land filings. "Then what do they want the land for?" "Silver." Rosa turned another page. "There's a geological survey federal done 2 years ago that shows a silver-bearing formation running under the valley floor. Not the mountains. The valley itself under the grazing land." She pointed to a notation in pencil barely legible cramped into a 1/4 inch of margin. "I heard the name of the survey report 3 times from different men. The Hartwell report, commissioned by the Interior Department, filed and then quietly removed from public access." Hargrove sat down slowly. "Removed how?" "The man who talked the most about it, a lawyer named Griggs, comes through twice a year, said it was reclassified as preliminary data. Means it exists, but can't be cited in a legal proceeding. Not without special petition." Rosa folded her hands on the table. "Means Aldrich and his syndicate know exactly what's under this ground, and the people who own the ground do not." Maggie was already writing. Not the numbers yet, the structure. The shape of what she was hearing, laid out in the logical sequence her father had taught her. What is known, what is inferred, what is documented, what requires further verification. She wrote fast and small, the way she wrote field notes, with the particular compression of someone who had learned that paper and lamplight were finite resources. "The fraudulent surveys aren't just to acquire grazing land cheaply," she said, not asking. "They're to establish clear title before anyone finds out about the silver. Once the syndicate owns the parcels outright bought at depressed prices from ranchers who settled under legal pressure, they can file mineral rights claims without challenge." That's what Griggs said, more or less in the language of a man talking to another man about money. Rosa looked at her steadily. "He said the survey fraud was the cheap part. He said the expensive part was keeping the Hartwell report inaccessible long enough to complete the acquisitions." "How long have they had?" "Griggs's last visit was 6 weeks ago. He said they were close. He said there was one holdout, a ranch with a former detective for an owner who kept filing procedural challenges, and one unexpected complication." Hargrove said, "The Western Territorial Survey Company." Prescott took their money to establish a legitimate survey presence in the valley. They needed someone credentialed to countersign the amended maps. It looks less fraudulent if there's an active survey company on record. When Prescott took the advance and disappeared east with it, they lost their cover. Rosa looked at Maggie. "And then you arrived. A real surveyor with federal training and no reason to cooperate." The kitchen was very quiet. Pete had stopped moving at the stove entirely. Cutter had come in at some point and was standing near the door with his arms folded, listening. Maggie set down her pencil and looked at what she'd written. The structure was clear, clearer than she'd wanted it to be, because clarity in this case meant the problem was larger and the Friday deadline was sharper, and the documentation she'd been building all week was only part of what was needed. "The Hartwell report," she said. If it's been reclassified, it can still be petitioned. But a petition takes weeks, sometimes months. We don't have weeks, Hargrove said. I know. She turned to a fresh page. But we don't need the report itself to make the case. We need evidence that Aldrich knew about it, that his acquisitions were made with foreknowledge of the mineral survey data. She looked at Rosa. Is Grigg still in the territory? Left Monday. Won't be back until spring. The lawyer who drafted the amended survey filings. Local. Man named Pratt. Office above the hardware store. Rosa paused. He's not in Aldrich's inner circle. He drafts what he's given. I don't think he knows the full picture. Does he know the surveys are fraudulent? Rosa considered that. He knows the measurements don't match the original patents. He's a lawyer. He reads documents. She paused again. He asked Aldrich directly once in my shop. Said he needed to understand the methodology before he could file in good conscience. Aldrich told him the original surveys were imprecise, that the amended maps corrected historical errors. She looked at her hands. Pratt accepted that. I think he wanted to accept it. A lawyer who wanted to accept a convenient explanation, Maggie said. He's not a villain, he's a liability. She turned to Hargrove. If I can show Pratt the discrepancy data, not in the context of a legal challenge, just as a technical demonstration, he may withdraw the filings voluntarily, before Friday, without a ruling. Hargrove looked at her. You think he'll walk away from Aldrich's money over a technical demonstration? I think he'll walk away from disbarment. She stood, went to the stove, poured coffee that had been sitting too long and was now strong enough to be medicinal. She drank it anyway. A lawyer who files documents he knows to be fraudulent doesn't get to claim he was deceived. If I show him the survey data and he continues to represent the filings, he becomes complicit. He knows that. Men like Pratt always know that. They just need someone to say it out loud. Cutter spoke from the door. Aldrich will know before morning if you go to Pratt. Yes. She turned around. That's the point. If Pratt withdraws the filings, Aldrich has nothing to take to the county judge on Friday. He'll have to refile, find new counsel, establish new documentation. That buys time, not weeks, but enough days to get the survey record to the Federal Land Office in Helena and petition for access to the Hartwell report through the circuit judge. She looked at Hargrove. Enough days for your contact to matter. He was reading her face with that steady attention, looking for the thing she hadn't said yet. She'd noticed he always did that. Waited for the part that was being left out. What does this cost you? He said. Going to Pratt directly. What's the risk? She held the coffee cup in both hands, let it warm the gloves she was still wearing. His gloves, which she hadn't returned. If Pratt is more afraid of Aldrich than of disbarment, he'll tell Aldrich I came to him. Then Aldrich knows exactly what I have, exactly how complete the survey record is, and exactly how much time remains before I can get it to a federal venue. She paused. He'll also know I know about the Hartwell report. And that makes you a different kind of problem than a surveyor with inconvenient measurements. Considerably different. She set the cup down. But the alternative is finishing the documentation tonight, sending Cutter to Helena with what we have, and hoping the federal petition moves fast enough to beat the Friday ruling. She looked around the table. Which is a reasonable plan, except that it leaves Aldrich's Friday filing unopposed at the county level, which means he gets the recording clerk to process the transfers over the weekend. And by the time the federal petition is heard, there will be a stack of recorded deeds sitting in the Millhaven courthouse that some judge will be very reluctant to unwind. Pete said quietly, So we need both. Everyone looked at him. He colored slightly, but didn't retract it. We need Cutter to take the survey document to Helena tonight, he said. And we need someone to go to Pratt tomorrow morning and delay the Friday filing. And we need both things to work, or at least one of them to work well enough to buy time for the other. Maggie looked at him with the specific attention she gave to correct answers. Yes, she said. That's right. Pete nodded, sat back, Let the room return to the people who were actually going to execute the plan. She worked until the lamp oil ran out, then moved the notebook closer to the stove and worked by firelight until Hargrove put a fresh lamp on the table without comment. The documentation ran to 14 pages in final form. Survey measurements, baseline calculations, federal patent citations, discrepancy analysis, the removed stake and its recorded position, the timeline of Aldrich's filings against the Valley landowners, and Rose's margin notes, transcribed in full as corroborating testimony. On the final page, she wrote her name, her professional credentials, and her father's credentials, and the date, and beneath the date, she wrote, "These measurements were taken in accordance with General Land Office survey standards as established by the Act of 1851 and subsequent federal guidelines. I attest to their accuracy under penalty of perjury." She signed it the way her father had taught her to sign professional documents. Full name, no flourishes, the signature of someone who understood what the signature meant. Cutter left before dawn with the document packet wrapped in oilcloth and addressed to the Helena Federal Land Office, a letter from Hargrove to his contact, and a second letter from Maggie to the office director with a complete technical summary written in the formal language of federal survey proceedings. She'd written that letter last when she was tired enough that the formal language came easier, and she'd written it well. She stood at the kitchen door and watched Cutter ride out in the dark, the package in his saddlebag, and she thought about her father sending documents to Washington from Ohio, all those years rolling up the survey maps, tying them, posting them, trusting that the federal system was worth trusting. She hoped he'd been right about that. Victor Aldrich's office occupied the ground floor of the building that housed the Millhaven land records, which was either convenient or strategic, depending on how you read the situation. The sign on the door read, "Aldrich Land and Title Services Established 1879. The paint was newer than the date suggested. Maggie went to Pratt's office first. She'd expected to wait. She didn't have to. The door was open and Harrison Pratt was already at his desk at 8 in the morning, which told her either he was a genuinely industrious lawyer or he had something on his mind that was making sleep difficult. His face when she walked in told her it was the second one. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. He knew her name. He'd done some homework, or someone had done it for him. "Please sit down." She sat. She put her father's notebook on the desk, between them, open to the North Pasture baseline calculations, and said, "I'm going to show you something, and I'd like you to look at it carefully before you say anything." He looked at it carefully. He was a neat man in his 40s, with the kind of face that had once been open and was now carefully managed. He understood numbers she could see that from the way his eyes moved down the columns, not scanning, but reading, actually reading, following the logic of the measurements. He got to the discrepancy figures. She watched his face. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to the next page and the next. He went through 5 pages without speaking, and when he stopped, it was at the page that showed the same false benchmark used across all 6 parcels, the pattern that no competent person could read as error. "Where did you get the original patent data?" he said. "My father copied it from federal records 2 years ago. I have the source citations on the final page." He turned to the final page, read the citations, sat back. "These are accurate," he said. "Not a question. They are." He folded his hands on the desk and looked at her with the eyes of a man who had accepted a convenient explanation and was now being shown what was behind it. "I was told the original surveys contained measurement errors, historical imprecision. I was told the amended maps corrected a genuine discrepancy in the original patent work." "You were told that by Victor Aldrich?" "Yes." "Mr. Pratt." She kept her voice level without accusation, the way she'd have explained a technical error to a student. "The original federal patents for this valley were surveyed by Army Corps engineers using benchmark markers that are physically present in the landscape. Granite outcroppings, permanent rock formations. I have resurveyed 3 of the affected parcels against those benchmarks in the past 4 days. The amended maps are not corrections. They are deliberate falsifications that consistently move the boundary lines in the same direction by amounts ranging from 380 to 430 yards. She paused. The direction consistently favors the acquisition of creek frontage timber access and valley floor acreage. It is not random error. He was quiet. I understand you may not have known what you were filing, she said. I am showing you this now so that you do know. What you do with that knowledge is your decision. He stood up, walked to his window, stood there for a moment looking out at the main street of Millhaven. His shoulders had the shape of a man carrying weight he hadn't expected to be carrying this early in the morning. If I withdraw the filings, he said without turning, Aldrich will find another lawyer. Probably. But he'll lose the Friday timeline, and that matters more than it might appear. She closed the notebook. There is a federal survey petition being filed in Helena today. There is a circuit judge arriving next Tuesday. And there is a geological survey report in federal archives that suggests the reason these particular parcels are being acquired has less to do with grazing rights than with mineral deposits. He turned from the window then. His carefully managed face had slipped just slightly in the way faces slipped when something landed harder than expected. The Hartwell report, he said. She said nothing. Let him hear his own voice saying it. He sat back down. He put both hands flat on the desk and looked at them. I didn't know about that. I want to be clear about that. I believe you. If what you're saying is accurate, if the acquisitions were made with foreknowledge of a federal mineral survey, then the entire scheme is fraudulent on a federal level, not just a county level. Every deed transfer, every settlement. He looked up. Every document I filed. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the main street of Millhaven was waking up boots on boardwalks, a horse at the post, the hardware store opening its shutters with the particular clatter of a business that had been performing the same action every morning for 20 years. I'll withdraw the Friday filings, he said. By noon today. I'll cite procedural review pending additional documentation. He paused. That buys you a week, possibly two, before Aldrich finds other counsel and refiles. That's enough time. Is it? He looked at her with the directness of someone who was now belatedly paying full attention. Because I want to understand something, Mrs. Caldwell. You arrived here with no client, no active contract, no local connections. You've spent a week in freezing conditions resurveying a valley on your own initiative. He studied her face. Why? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the right answer, which was the true one, and whether it would help or hurt, and decided it didn't matter either way, because it was the only one she had. My father spent 20 years making sure the lines on federal maps corresponded to the lines on actual ground, she said, so that when the government told a family they owned a piece of land, they actually owned it. Not approximately, not close enough. Exactly. She stood, picked up the notebook. Someone moved the lines. I have the skills to prove it, and the documentation to put them back where they belong. She looked at him. That's sufficient reason. He nodded slowly. She moved to the door. Mrs. Caldwell. She stopped, turned. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized she'd seen it on her father's face when a difficult calculation resolved cleanly a combination of relief and something that was close to grief, because the resolution had cost something. The ranchers who already settled with Aldrich, Henderson and the others. If the federal case succeeds, if the deeds are unwound, will they get their land back? That's a legal question, she said, not a survey question. I know. I'm asking whether you think they will. She held the door. I think that depends on who argues for them, she said. And whether anyone with knowledge of the scheme decides that full disclosure to the federal court is a better position than complicity. She left him with that and walked out into the cold Millhaven morning, and behind her she heard him pick up his pen, and the sound of it scratching across paper was either the withdrawal notice or it wasn't, and she would know which within the hour, and until then the frozen boardwalk under her boots was solid, and the survey notebook in her satchel was 14 pages of documented truth that no one could move or pull or throw 30 yards into the brush. Hargrove was waiting at the end of the block with 2 horses and the particular stillness of a man who had been in enough difficult situations to know that waiting was its own kind of work. She walked toward him, and the cold came off the mountains, and the street was quiet, and the morning was not over, and there was still Billy Crane somewhere in this town, and Victor Aldrich in his office, 200 yards behind her, who would know within the hour what she had done. "Pratt's withdrawing the Friday filings," she said, reaching him. He handed her the reins of the second horse. "And Aldrich." "Aldrich doesn't know yet." She took the reins, checked the saddle without looking at him. "He will by noon." "Then we've got a few hours." "Yes." She looked up at him, then directly with the specific attention she usually reserved for numbers that needed to be read exactly right. "Are you ready for what comes after noon?" He looked back at her the same way, not around her, not past her at her, the way he'd been doing since the kitchen table on the first night when she'd spread the baseline calculations between them and he'd followed every line. "I've been ready since you drove that first stake," he said. She put her boot in the stirrup and swung up, and they rode back through Millhaven side by side, and the morning held its breath, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and under the valley floor the silver lay quiet in the dark, waiting to be what it was going to be, regardless of who owned the ground above it. And above it all, the lines on the federal maps were for the first time in more than a year beginning to move back toward where her father had always known they belonged. Aldrich knew by 11. Maggie knew he knew, because Billy Crane rode past the ranch road at a pace that wasn't casual, heading north toward the valley's far end, where 2 of the settled ranchers had their homesteads, and then turned back within 20 minutes without stopping anywhere. He was taking stock, counting what was still in play and what had moved beyond his reach. She watched him from the kitchen window and noted the time in her notebook. Hargrove came in from the barn, where he'd been doing the specific kind of physical work men did when they were managing controlled anger-splitting wood that didn't need splitting, moving things that didn't need moving. He looked at her face and said, "Crane." "Riding the valley. He's not coming here yet." She closed the notebook. "Aldrich will want to talk to Pratt first. Understand what happened and why. Then he'll decide his next move." "What is his next move?" "He has 3 options." She counted them on her fingers, not for his benefit, but because organizing information physically helped her think. First, he finds new counsel and refiles before the circuit judge arrives Tuesday, hoping the county clerk processes the transfers fast enough to create a fait accompli. Second, he makes a direct approach to the federal land office in Helena to contest the petition Cutter filed, claims the survey data is incomplete or improperly certified. Third, she stopped. Third, he said. Third, he decides the documentation I have is dangerous enough that removing it is worth the risk of what comes after. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "The notebook," he said. "The notebook." She picked up her coffee. "The copy Cutter took to Helena is filed and received. Aldrich can't touch that. But the original data, my father's field notes, the baseline calculations, the corroborating records, those are here. A federal filing without the original supporting documentation is weaker, contestable." She set the cup down. "He knows that." Hargrove looked at the satchel on the table. "We should move it. I already made 2 copies last night. They're with Rosa." She saw his expression and said, "I didn't sleep much." "Maggie." "The copies are rough but complete. If the original notebook is taken, the copies stand." She stood, picked up the satchel, and held it out to him. "But I'd rather not test that. Can you put this somewhere on the property that isn't the obvious place?" He took it without argument. She noticed that too, the absence of argument, the way he received information about her preparations, the way Cutter received survey instructions as data that could be acted upon, rather than evidence of a problem that needed managing. He was gone for 10 minutes and came back without the satchel and didn't tell her where it was, which was exactly right. Sam came in at noon. "Aldrich is at the sheriff's office." What sheriff? Hargrove asked. Brand new one, apparently. Rode in this morning on the early stage. Sam pulled off his hat. Man named Cole. Never seen him before. Young clean wears his badge like he just got it. He looked at Maggie. Asked around about you specifically, whether you'd been conducting surveys without a territorial license. She almost laughed. Montana Territory doesn't require a separate territorial license for federal survey work. The federal credential supersedes it. Does the brand new sheriff know that? He knows what Aldrich told him. She stood. Which means I need to get there before Aldrich finishes telling him the rest. Hargrove was already reaching for his coat. No, she said. He stopped. If you come with me, it looks like I need protecting. It looks like the survey work is yours, and I'm attached to it. She buttoned her coat, settled her father's satchel, the empty decoy one she kept for exactly this kind of situation, across her shoulder. I need it to look like what it is, a credentialed surveyor responding to a question about her professional standing. She looked at him steadily. I know what I'm doing. He put his coat back on the hook. His jaw worked the way it did when he was choosing between saying something and not saying it, and he chose not, which cost him something, and she respected that it cost him. If you're not back in 2 hours, he said, I'm coming anyway. Fair, she said, and walked out. The sheriff's office smelled of fresh paint and anxiety. Cole was young, barely 30, with the careful posture of someone performing authority rather than inhabiting it. He sat behind the desk with the particular straightness of a man who'd been told to appear senior and was working hard at it. Victor Aldrich sat in the chair across from him, relaxed in the specific way of men who were accustomed to being the most powerful person in a room. Billy Crane stood by the door. Maggie walked in, assessed all three and the time it took to close the door behind her, and sat down in the remaining chair before anyone invited her to. Mrs. Caldwell, Aldrich said. His voice was pleasant. It was the pleasantness of a man who had decided that pleasantness was the appropriate instrument for this particular moment. He was in his 50s, heavy-set through the shoulders with the kind of face that had learned to arrange itself into whatever expression the situation required. I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk. Mr. Aldrich. She looked at Cole. Sheriff, I understand there was a question about my survey credentials. Cole cleared his throat. There's been a concern raised about unlicensed survey activity on private land. My federal survey credential was issued by the Army Corps of Engineers in 1876 and renewed in 1881. She reached into her coat and put the document on the desk. It authorizes survey work on any land subject to federal patent law anywhere in the United States. Montana Territory is subject to federal patent law. That credential supersedes any territorial licensing requirement. She folded her hands. Is there another concern? Cole looked at the document, then at Aldrich. Aldrich smiled. The credential question is a minor matter. What I'd really like to discuss is the petition your associate filed in Helena this morning. He leaned forward slightly. It makes some significant claims about survey methodology in this valley. Claims that if taken seriously by the Federal Land Office, could create considerable disruption for a number of legitimate business transactions. The claims are supported by 14 pages of documented survey data referenced against original federal patents, she said. The methodology is standard, the discrepancies are not. Survey work is imprecise, especially historical work done under difficult conditions. Army Corps benchmark surveys are not imprecise. That's the purpose of permanent granite markers. The measurements I took this week match my father's 1881 field notes to within 2 feet on every parcel. She looked at him directly. The amended maps your surveyor filed deviate from the federal baseline by an average of 406 yards. Consistently, in the same direction, on 6 separate parcels. She paused. That is not imprecision, Mr. Aldrich. His pleasantness didn't shift. That was the thing about men like Aldrich. The pleasantness wasn't a mask over anger, it was a tool, and he used it the way she used a theodolite, with patience and precision. You're a woman alone in a territory where you have no contracts, no clients, and no established practice. I'm curious what your interest in this valley actually is. I answered that question in my petition to the Federal Land Office. You're welcome to read it. I did read it. He picked up a folded paper from the desk. Her letter, she recognized the format, which meant Aldrich had a contact in Helena fast enough to copy and courier a filed document overnight. She filed that fact away. You describe your father's notes as the basis of your baseline calculations. Your father died last spring. This notebook, he tapped the paper, was in his possession at time of death. Legally, his estate's property. I'm wondering whether you have proper authority to use private estate records for professional purposes. It was a good move. She'd anticipated something like it. She kept her face exactly as it was. My father left his professional instruments and field records to me, specifically in his will, she said. Executed March 4, 1882, witnessed and notarized in Franklin County, Ohio. The estate was settled in August. The instruments and records transferred to me as sole heir. She looked at him. I can have those documents here by Tuesday's stage. The circuit judge will be here Tuesday as well. That will be a useful coincidence. The first crack appeared. Not on his face that stayed pleasant, but in his body something that settled slightly differently, the microscopic adjustment of a man recalculating. Cole was looking between them with the expression of someone who had expected a licensing dispute and was now watching something considerably larger than that develop across his desk. The circuit judge, Aldrich said, Judge Harlan Moore, federal appointment. He has a particular interest in land fraud cases in territorial jurisdictions. She kept her voice level and informational the way she read measurements. He also has access to federal records that are not available at the county level, including reclassified geological surveys. The pleasant expression didn't change, but his hands, she noticed, moved from the desk to his lap. Crane shifted by the door. I think, Aldrich said, that you may have gotten yourself involved in something more complicated than a survey dispute, Mrs. Caldwell. A woman in your position, no family here, no established connections, working in conditions that are frankly dangerous for someone alone, might find that certain complications resolve themselves more smoothly if she focused on other opportunities. She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, Are you offering me money? I'm suggesting that your talents are obviously considerable and might find better application elsewhere. I have connections with several established survey firms in Denver and San Francisco who would be interested in someone with your credentials. Letters of introduction, travel expenses. He paused. A fresh start in a city with considerably more opportunity for a woman of your abilities. It was generous, she thought. It was also the moment she'd been working toward all week without quite naming it, because it was the moment when Aldrich's actions confirmed everything Rosa's ledger implied. A man who was confident in the legitimacy of his land transactions didn't offer a surveyor a job in Denver to resolve a methodology dispute. Sheriff Cole, she said without looking away from Aldrich. I'd like to note for the record that Mr. Aldrich has just offered me financial inducement to withdraw a federal survey petition. That's obstruction of a federal proceeding. Cole went very still. Aldrich's pleasantness finally shifted not to anger, but to something colder and more considered. That's not what I said. You offered travel expenses, letters of introduction, and employment connections in exchange for my departure from this territory, while an active federal petition is under review. She looked at Cole. Would you like to write that down, Sheriff? Or shall I? Cole picked up a pen. Crane moved away from the door one step toward her, and Hargrove walked in from the street. He hadn't waited 2 hours. He'd waited 40 minutes, and she suspected he'd been on the boardwalk outside for most of them. He came through the door at the exact moment Crane moved, and he stopped with his hands loose at his sides and looked at Crane with the eyes of a former Pinkerton detective who had been in enough rooms with enough dangerous men to know exactly what he was looking at. Billy, he said quietly. Sit down. Crane looked at Aldrich. Aldrich gave a small, controlled nod. Crane sat down. The room reconfigured itself around this new arrangement, Aldrich still in his chair now, without the option of Crane as a physical variable. Cole behind his desk with his pen in his hand, and the expression of someone who had just understood that the document he was about to write was the most significant thing he would do in his first week as sheriff. Hargrove standing by the door, not threatening, not performing, just present. Solid as a baseline marker. Maggie turned back to Aldrich. "Here is what happens next," she said. "The federal petition is heard Tuesday by Judge Moore. The survey documentation is already filed and received my copies, my father's original notes, and Rosa Espinosa's corroborating testimony about the conversations she recorded over 4 years of your associates using her laundry as an office." She watched his face carefully as she said Rosa's name. "The petition includes a formal request for access to the Hartwell report under the Federal Records Disclosure Statute. Judge Moore has the authority to grant that access without a secondary petition. Given the evidence of coordinated fraud across 6 parcels using falsified survey data, I expect he will." Aldrich said nothing. His hands were very still. "The ranchers who settled with you did so under legal duress created by fraudulent documents," she continued. "Harrison Pratt has withdrawn the remaining Friday filings and has indicated a willingness to provide testimony regarding the circumstances under which he was engaged to represent those filings. That testimony, combined with the survey evidence and the Hartwell report, constitutes a federal fraud case that extends well beyond land disputes in Ravalli County." She paused. "You should talk to a lawyer. One you didn't hire yourself." Cole set down his pen. "Mr. Aldrich, I'm going to need you to remain available for further questioning." Aldrich stood. He straightened his coat with the careful deliberateness of a man who was not going to let this room see him unsteady. He looked at Maggie for a long moment with eyes that had stopped being pleasant and were now simply measuring the way things got measured when decisions were being made. "Your father taught you well," he said. "He taught me that the numbers don't lie," she said. "People do, but the numbers don't." He walked out. Crane followed. Cole looked at the door they'd left through, and then at Maggie, and then at the notes on his desk and said, "I'll need a formal statement." "You'll have it by this afternoon," she said. She stood. Her legs were steady. She'd wondered coming into this room whether they would be. They were. Then, outside, Hargrove fell into step beside her without comment on the 2 hours he hadn't waited. "Crane," she asked. "Riding south. Fast." He looked at the road. "Aldrich won't be far behind him, I'd estimate." "He won't run before Tuesday. He still thinks he can contest the petition." She walked. "He's wrong, but he thinks it, which means we have the weekend and Monday to prepare for the hearing." "Rosa." "Rosa is already protected. I told her 3 days ago to keep copies of her ledger with Father Mendez at the church. Aldrich knows about her now, but the records are already distributed." She looked at him sideways. "I planned for that." "You planned for most of this." "Not all of it." She kept walking. "I didn't plan for Pratt having a conscience. That was fortunate. You gave him the opportunity to use it. I showed him the numbers. He did the rest himself." She stopped at the corner where the street met the road north. The Bitterroot Valley spread ahead, the winter grass, pale, the mountains white above the tree line. The sky, the particular blue of cold air with no humidity in it. The settled ranchers, Henderson and the others. Pratt's testimony about how those settlements were structured will matter more than my survey data for getting their land back. But it will take time. Federal proceedings move slowly. Some of them needed that money to survive the winter. "I know." She looked at him. "That's the part I can't fix with a survey. The part where people were already hurt before the numbers could be proven." She paused. "I want to be clear about that. What I did this week establishes the fraud. It doesn't undo the damage that was already done." He looked at her with the directness he'd been giving her all week, steady and without evasion. "It stops more damage from being done." "Yes. That matters." "Yes," she said again. It does. They stood there for a moment, and the wind came off the mountains carrying the smell of pine and cold water, and the particular cleanness of high country air, and behind them, Millhaven went about its Saturday business. And ahead of them, the valley ran north toward the granite outcropping, where her first stake still stood in the frozen ground, the flag snapping, marking the place where the line had always been. "The circuit judge arrives Tuesday," she said. "I'll need to be at that hearing. After that—" She stopped. "After that," he said. She looked at him. She'd been careful all week, in the way she was always careful, watching, noting, filing things away, in the column in her mind labeled things that are true but not yet relevant. The handshake that treated her as an equal. The coffee she could carry. The gloves given without comment still on her hands. The 2 hours he hadn't waited. The way he'd come through that door at exactly the moment Crane had moved, as if he'd been calibrating the timing from outside with the same precision she used on baseline measurements. She was a widow who had arrived in a strange territory with $23 and her dead father's instruments, and the specific determination of a woman who had learned that nothing was truly hers unless she had documented proof of it. She had documented proof of quite a lot now. "The valley will need an independent survey practice," she said. "Someone to maintain the federal baseline records, verify future transactions, make sure the lines stay where they belong." She watched his face. "That's not a job that ends with one case." "No," he said. "It's not. I'd need an office, access to the county records, a horse that actually responds to rain pressure because the one you lent me today has opinions about direction that are not useful in survey work." She paused. "And a proper lamp. And the one at Mrs. Farwell's is completely inadequate." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something better than a smile, the expression of a man who had recognized something true. "The ranch has a room that would work as an office," he said. "South-facing window, good light." "I noticed that room." "I thought you might have." She looked at the valley again. At the line of the mountains, the specific angle of the light, the way the creek caught it at the bend, the wrong bend, the one Aldrich's surveyor had used, which she would now document correctly and permanently for the federal record. She thought about her father's handwriting in the margins of the notebook, the entries that stopped and the ones that started again in her own hand. She thought about the 14 pages filed in Helena, and the copies with Rosa, and the original in whatever hole in the ground or wall cavity Hargrove had put it safe exact documented. She thought about Thomas Caldwell signing away her family's land with his name on a document she hadn't been permitted to contest, and the lawyer who'd smiled because he already knew the ruling, and the specific moment she'd understood that the only protection against that kind of loss was knowledge precise enough to be unchallengeable and documented proof that could withstand any court in any territory. She'd spent 4 years building that knowledge. She'd spent 1 week in a frozen valley using it. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. "Nate," he said. She looked at him and she let herself look at him the way she looked at survey data when the numbers came in exactly right with the quiet recognition of something true confirming itself. "Nate," she said. "The south-facing room. Does it have a good table?" "I'll build you one," he said. They walked back toward the ranch together as the Montana afternoon shortened toward evening, and the cold came down from the mountains the way it always did, impartial and absolute. And the valley floor held its silver secret in the dark below the frozen grass. And above it all, the lines on the federal maps held where they belonged, documented and sworn and signed in her name. Because a woman had come to this valley with her father's instruments and his 20 years of careful work and the unshakable conviction that the truth of where things stood was worth measuring, exactly worth bleeding for, worth the cold, worth staying for, and she had proven it, parcel by parcel, stake by stake, number by number, in the precise and permanent language of documented fact, that no man with a convenient explanation and a paid-off courthouse clerk could move or alter or take away. The lines held. They would keep holding. That was the point of driving them in the first place.